guys actually had something that wasn't during the day. Because like I work full time. So this was actually a time I could make. And since COVID, like continuing education stuff has just been so difficult to get to that I was like, oh, I can sneak into this one.
Great. Welcome. I am going to turn the floor over to Mona. Mona, thank you so much for running this tonight, and we are looking forward to your guidance as always.
Awesome. Thank you. I think don't be annoyed with the fact that you're the only one. I think this is often the time that a lot of coaches are still in the pool deck. So for them, 7 o'clock is not always a good time either. So it's kind of like what works and what doesn't. But I think the idea here is that it's going to be a recording, so it can be, and coupled with the infographics, it will be super helpful kind of thing. So today what I'll talk about is creating psychological safe spaces for success. That's a new buzzword that has really become a big thing about creating safety in different ways than just physical safety or things like that. And what I'm really going to do is talk about some of the top tips from sports science that how we can kind of create that. Just a disclosure, I really wanted to use this photo because everybody knows that's Dave right there at Schrader Pool, and happens to be taken by a friend of mine took this photo, and I actually screenshot it from the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, which is my organization, and I thought it was really funny to see Dave's picture in there. All right, so let's see how I can change my slide. All right, I'll do a really brief introduction of myself. So my sport and sports psychology background is that I used to be a competitive figure skater in my native Finland. I also played competitive flag football in Finland. And then I was a part of the high school varsity track and field team. I did a lot of triple jumping and long jumping when I was an exchange student in the USA. I then went back to my native Finland and became a professional figure and synchronized skating coach for several years, before I decided to sell my apartment and sell my car and go back to school, where I went to study sport and performance psychology in the UK. And I ended up being a sport and performance psychology professor, first in the UK and then in the US. And I've done some stints in Finland and Germany, as well as a visiting academic scholar. And then I work as a sport and performance psychology consultant here in the US, mainly through the CMPC certification, which is a certified mental performance consultant. I don't really have a swimming background per se, because I'm not a swimmer. I think my fastest 1,000-meter of like the old lady with the blue hair breaststroke, where I don't put my head around the under the water, took 29 minutes when I was a teenager. So not really a really good swimmer per se. I am a swim parent, so Arvinen-Barrow is my daughter. She has swam her career here in Shorewood for Shorewood Swim Club, and then Shorewood High School, now swims for Brown University and the Gambia national team. I'm also a swim official, so Shorewood Swim Club official, and I have done a lot of sports psychology consultancy for swimmers, and I currently serve the Wisconsin Swimming Board of Directors as the Safe Sport Chair. So that's kind of like my swimming background. What I do this is sort of part of the safe sport agenda, knowing where it has been moving away from being reactive to really trying to be proactive, and how do we create a healthy and positive environment free from abuse for all its members. That's one of the reasons why I'm kind of doing these series of seminars that we've done so far. So what today is a part of the 4 different webinars and infographics that I'm creating for Wisconsin Swimming. First one we did it for the parents, to really how to raise children who swim. And then about a month ago, we did another one about swim philosophy, how to be successful in your philosophy, and that was aimed for athletes. Today, we're doing a session for coaches, and in a couple of weeks, I'll do one for officials as well. How do you create a psychologically safe spaces on the pool deck, and see how you can create that to be very more successful for the athletes that we all serve. Today's goal and disclaimers are here. So I'm going to share my top 10 tips from sports science. I'm not going to kind of refer to a lot of the science. The science is there, and citations are for you to find later on the website. But I really want to kind of think about the ways in which you as a coach can create psychological safe spaces for success. I'm more likely not going to tell you a lot of things new, but it's more about the idea of raise awareness and perhaps package some of those things that you already know and do intuitively or very deliberately in your work already in a slightly different way. So a lot of those will be about packaging things and become more cognizant of how we do this work as a whole. In addition, I want to teach you two important phrases in Finnish. So that's be my native Finnish language. My disclaimers for today is that this is all rooted in sports science, and they are influenced by professional, personal experiences of mine, both as a coach and all my other hats that I wear in the sport domain. I will also create or publish, they're created, supplemental infographics, which has all of this information in greater detail, some of the background information, and then some of the things that we'll talk about today as well. Those will all be available for you from the Wisconsin Swimming website. And I'll also create the full list of citations and sources and upload it after this on the website, so you can go and look at them if you want to at your own will. All right, so here we go. Let's start with the tips. So the first top tip to me is the art and science of successful coaching is a delicate balance between intention and intuition. So the idea that we work all the time, there's a lot of things that we do very intuitively that is based on our experiences and things that we just know to be the right way. We know the way to be like, this is how I've done it. There's no real explanation for it. It just really is an intentional thing that we go with our guts and we go with that gut feeling. And I think that's absolutely really great. And most of the time we actually hit the nail in the mark by doing that, because we have all of this knowledge that we've already gathered as an athlete and then as a young coach and as later on in life as well. But what I'm trying to do today is to say that actually part of that is that when we do train the tactical and technical aspects and the physical sides of the sport, we don't rely as much on intuition. We also do very deliberate things. So we are very intentional in what kind of training we do, what kind of intervals we work on and things like that. But when it comes to the psychological part, whether it's about team building, whether about boosting confidence, whether it's about motivation and things like that, we tend to rely a lot more on the intention rather than the science behind it. So what I'm really trying to do today is to bring you a little bit more of the science and the theories and packaging these psychological things in a way that you can try to find more of those intentional ways. That how do you use your words intentionally to increase one's autonomy? Or how do you use those words intentionally to challenge the athlete in a way that pushes them to the next level? If we look at what the Olympic movement currently says in the Athlete 365, it says that successful coaches have all of these different skills that are sort of very prominent in those. One of them is understanding the sport, eagerness to learn, so kind of like a lifelong learner, sharing knowledge, not just with athletes, but with others as well, having a really good motivational skills, knowing who they're dealing with, so the athlete really well. A lot of it is about effective communication, listening skills, which to me go hand in hand, leading by example, so having behaviors that actually are something similar to what they practice, what they preach, being very disciplined, and having a commitment and passion. I don't think any of these things are rocket science. I don't think any of them are something that coaches don't have. I think they all have those really well. The differences, are those usually run through intuition or are they very intentional? So I always say to my students in the classroom too, I said, I'm very intentional in everything that I say word-wise from the first session to the last. And then I usually reveal what was intentional in the first session to the last. And they're like, oh, that totally makes sense. So how do we make sure that we use our language in a way that our communication, our listening and things in a way that actually motivates them in an intentional way? So when it comes to thinking about your role as a coach using the intentional and intuition, thinking about asking yourself things like, which of these qualities that I listed over there are my main strengths? And what are those areas that I can be a little bit better? What can I improve and why? Which of these qualities do I rely on intuition? And which of these qualities do I rely on intention? And why do I do that? Is it because I just know how that works? Is it because that's my personality? Or is it really because I have all that knowledge and I really go into intentional way? Or is it more about the fact that I'm not quite sure how it works, so I'll just kind of go with the flow in it? None of those things are wrong. They're all really great ways of doing it, but I think it's really important to sort of reflect on and say, where do I find that knowledge from, and how do I act, and how do I behave, and how do I communicate that I foster all of these qualities in myself? The next one, I think it's a really important one, and this has gained a lot of traction when it comes to current sports science literature. This is an old formula. It has been there for whatever in life in general, but the top tip two is that competitive swimming occurs in a set of very complex interconnected systems. And what that means, and what I've created here, is basically simplifying it to the context of competitive swimming. According to all of these systems, if you look at the core of it, at the center of it is the athlete. Athlete is the one that is kind of like the minute person in the middle. And within the athlete, we can put their personalities, their thoughts and emotions and behaviors and their physical abilities and all of that into it. The athlete is always surrounded by other people, so creating lots of interprofessional or interrelationship between other people. And in that second layer is parents and coaches and teammates and officials, and often sports medicine team members. I put that there because most athletes will see some kind of a strength and conditioning coach or physical therapist or something along the way of during their career. The next layer of these connections is actually the environment where all of this takes place. So it's the practices, it's the swim meets, the dry lands, the training trips. Those are the four most common ones that I would say that in a sport of swimming with the children and youth are big environments where it happens. The following layer where all of this takes place is those national governing bodies and the systems and the organizations where all of this takes place. And if we go all the way from the top, we can look at World Aquatics, then we look at USA Swimming, the Zone Swimming. NCAA is another entity that kind of goes there in the middle. We got the LSCs, which Wisconsin Swimming is one of them. We got Swim Club, then we can high school, which is another different way of going on a sideways. And then somewhere we also have the summer leagues. All of those are governing organizational settings that has an impact on how the practices and the meets and the dryland and training trips and so forth are run. Above all of that is then the different policies and things like that that are more cultural in nature. So there's the formal rules and regulations that we all know from coming from USA Swimming, the rules and regulations book. Then we got the sport ethic, culture, norms, and values. All of those play a significant role how the sport is governed by the World Aquatics, USA Swimming, and so forth. And sometimes those vary quite greatly depending on the cultural context that we're in. So for example, the way a swim meet is run in terms of rules and regulations are governed by World Aquatics, but a culture of United States, swimming in the United States, may look very different than it does in some of the European countries or African countries. And that brings in a lot of the ethics and culture and norms and values. And we all know about the hype now going about what's been going on in China and having the athletes who's been caught doping and are still allowed to compete. All of those things are layers of policies that are shaped by different cultures, which now World Aquatics are trying to deal with. And on top of that layer is what we call is like the chronological and time-related things that we have very little control over. That includes various global and national events, and most notably right now, COVID-19 and all the aftermath that we're dealing with that. It includes all the social justice movements and increased mental health awareness. Those are the three that our current generations and society is really dealing with. The reason why I bring this up is that as a coach, while you're the second closest to, or the first closest to the athlete and kind of like at the center of the core, you are really integral, not only influencing the athlete in the middle, but navigating those within and between layers activities. A lot of coaches are very much in charge of what practices, swim meets, and drylands and training trips look like. So you have a lot of control over those second layer, like the second biggest layer after you. A lot of coaches also serve at different ways at the different levels of the organizational setting. So some of may be actually sitting with World Aquatics, some USA Swimming, a lot of are involved in local swimming committees and things like that. And you are the people who actually truly understand those formal rules and regulations better than the athlete does, better than a lot of the coaches and the younger coaches, better than the athletes' teammates, and better than the parents. So coaches, while being kind of like the second tier of the away, first tier of the athlete, you actually have a very integral part of navigating all of these different layers in a way that if done really well, you are able to really influence the experience that the athlete and all of those other people around them have in a way that has a lifelong impact on the people. So looking at again about what are the critical questions, I think it's really important that you as a coach kind of reflect on the things that how can you influence these levels and what are they actually doing and putting constraints on you. So thinking about back, and I think some of the key questions are, in my working environment, which levels of the systems are the strongest and most optimal for high performance? And why is that? What are those things that actually are making my high performance setting not work as well as I want it to? And then when considering those connections within and between those different levels, am I able to influence some of those directly? How can I influence them? And why can I influence? And what are the things that I can't directly influence, but can I influence them indirectly? How and why can I do that? And are there some that I have absolutely no influence over and they're indirectly, I can't do anything about it, and yet you still have to kind of navigate and live with it. But this way we can sort of identify those factors that what can we control and what can we make better and how can we make the environment better for those athletes and the parents and the officials and ourselves when we work in these settings. All right, so my third top tip, this is one that I've shared with athletes as well, because I think it's a really important to recognize where does all of this peak performance kind of sit. And in a way, my top tip is that sport injury and peak performance exist on a continuum. And I'm changing my little screen here so I can kind of see the text and stuff. But if we look at it from this way, it's kind of like an athletic seesaw. And being an athlete is all about characterized ups and downs. And at any given time, an athlete is somewhere on that continuum, either at the injury end or all the way to peak performance. And somewhere along the line, while they train, they're going to be somewhere in the middle. Typically, athletes in the sport of swimming, when they get a little bit older, the peak performance end is only kind of the times when they taper. And they try to keep themselves somewhere on the side of the peak performance at any given time, maybe close for somewhere in the middle, just to make sure that they can continue to train and be better. If it looks like the seesaw is starting to tip towards the injury side, and sometimes that can be there's an illness involved, there's a little bit of a niggle comes into their shoulder or something like that, or there's a little bit more illness and a little bit more stressors that are coming, and the athlete is saying, well, I'm no longer sort of like on the right side of the seesaw, but I'm sort of slipping towards the injury. That's a really, really important cue to recognize, okay, what's going on so we don't fall all the way to the injury. Obviously, some injuries are acute and gets you there straight away, but I would argue that underlying that there may have been some signs that the body was saying that we're not fully there, that weren't listened, and then something happened and put them over there. In this seesaw, like any other seesaw, there is a triangle at the bottom that kind of should be somewhat equal. So the three sides of that is the technical and tactical side of sport. One is the physical and biological, and I map things like sleep and nutrition into that. And at the bottom, as the foundation for the triangle, is the psychological and social aspects of the sport. The really important thing is that we need to make sure that this triangle is balanced, and sometimes an imbalance here, so let's just say somebody is not sleeping well, has an impact on the mood, and then obviously kind of filters down to the pool, which then can have a knock-on effect that the seesaw board is no longer balanced. The important part is to recognize that it's our job as coaches to make sure that all those three sides are attended to. That does not mean the coach has to do all of it, but we need to make sure that we kind of take care of those. What this really means is that no path to sport to success is linear. There are a lot of ups and downs. A lot of times the triangle gets a little lopsided, and that's perfectly normal. The key is to make sure that how do we then, when we see the lopsidedness coming up, how do we then fix it? The same philosophy that I explained about the athlete seesaw kind of applies to creating our training plans as well. If we are creating an effective training cycle, that's all about pushing our bodies physically to its limits. And it's a continued balance between stressing the body physically and mentally to its limits, and then ensuring you get the appropriate rest and recovery. So it's kind of like we test our bodies, we overtrain it, overpush it a little bit to see, can we get to the next level or no? If unsuccessful, it usually results in injury. If successful, we get those performance gains that we want. So I think it's important that we kind of start looking at this from the perspective that every performance enhancement ultimately is also about injury prevention, because what we really want to do is push the athletes teetering at the border of pushing the physical and psychological stress to the point that allows us to get the performance gains, while also making sure that we get the right amount of rest and recovery for it. And one of the food for thoughts for this one to me is that the research has really identified stress, both the physical and psychosocial, as the core psychophysiological state in performance enhancement. It's also identified stress as a significant risk factor for overtraining and injury and burnout. And since that's true, shouldn't all performance enhancement effort that we make actually consciously also consider injury prevention efforts to reducing the stress in the right way? What's really important here then, thinking about those questions, I'm not going to read all of these, but if we look at the performance board, which is the injury and the peak performance one, I think important for coaches is to really ask, like, how much time do my athletes actually spend on the injury side of the board? And are there any patterns you can identify when they're on that injury side? Are there specific injuries? So are many of them getting the same injuries? Are they getting similar illnesses? Is there a time of season when they spend more time there than not? Is there a time in your training cycle that they seem to be more on that side? Is there a very significant life events or school events that are taking place when a lot of these injured athletes end up on the other side of the board? And then I think if you look at the whole idea, what I talked about in top tip one, when we look at the triangle that is at the base of all of this, how much intentional effort do I plan and invest on the training, the planning and training of the technical or tactical side? And the same thing for the other ones. Am I addressing the physical and biological side with intentionality? What about the psychological and the social side? Is it intentional or is it based on intuition? So that kind of gives you an idea of where you are and what could you be doing more systematically and maybe better for your athletes. All right, let's move forward. So the next one, and this is probably doesn't come as a surprise or anything, but I mean, we've now a couple of years out of the main bulk of the pandemic, and it's really safe to say that the post-pandemic kids are different. They are very different in lots of different ways. And when I really start thinking about it, it actually is kind of coming to a point that the biggest difference that has happened is because their spaces that they occupy changed drastically during pandemic. And if we look at the literature, we really talk about that there's like the three different spaces that are really important for us as humans. The first one is the home. Home is the place where we are with our families, with our families and like significant others and things like that. And the second space is either school and or work. And the third space, where sports club, like swim clubs actually fall into, is all of those spaces where we kind of like combine the things that we are in the first and the second space and come to our own and become who we are. What happened during pandemic was that the third space, for the large extent, was actually taken away or stripped in some ways. It was changed, thinking about swimming, it changed how many people can be on the lane. It took away locker rooms, so kids can no longer talk in the locker rooms after their swimming. They merely came to the pool, separated them by 6 feet, and only did swimming. So, and equally, that what happened in a pandemic, the first space and second space kind of combined. So all of a sudden, parents were working from home, school was happening from home. And equally, there was a fourth space that had already started to emerge, but took a whole different meaning during pandemic. And the being online platforms using social media kind of intertwined itself to all of these spaces in a different ways. What that then meant is that our children who typically learn how to socialize and learn how to behave at schools with their friends no longer had that opportunity. You know, thinking about 13 and over, middle schools and up. Big change in that psychologically and socially happens is that we start looking for peers and coaches for advice rather than our parents. Well, a lot of our current post-pandemic kids did not have that opportunity. They had to live in these spaces that was an amalgamation of different spaces, and all of those were kind of intertwined together. So based on that, there was a lot of differences that happened, and their social skills and ability to navigate space face to face is very different than those who did not go through the pandemic or were grown-ups during the pandemic. And not to mention that they've also witnessed people dying around them, people getting sick, anxiety, depression, all of those mental health concerns have absolutely amplified. And then if we put it in a bigger context of the circles that I just showed you, during the pandemic, we also had a rise in social justice movements. All of those things were compounded and actually created a trauma response. And not to mention, it took them away from their pool for a while, which kind of in some ways can be akin to having an injury, even though there was nothing wrong with the person themselves. When there's no pool to swim in, that means you're not swimming, and it's kind of like you got injured and you need to kind of get back. So if we really look at these post-pandemic kids, they all look very different, and they really have some ideas of how they like to be treated. So the literature has talked about the post-pandemic Zoomers and the alphas, and I've kind of highlighted those, the five main ones, and they really like to be in the know. They want to, you know, plan. And so what that means is that you need to plan and communicate expectations consistently and ahead of time. They don't like to be thrown in things at the last minute, because that is triggering for those trauma responses when everything was taken out of their control. They also like to be in control. Remember, their lives were stripped apart in a different way overnight. That's not to say it didn't affect us as well, but I'm not the one who missed out on a prom. I'm also not the one who missed out on a graduation. So for somebody who's my age, it didn't really affect my life same way as it did for those who are missing out the first or the last of something when the time just went on and COVID didn't allow them to do that. So one way to help them to be in control is maybe build a bank of catch-up days that can foster a sense of autonomy and ownership. What that means is that they have a certain amount of days that they can be away from practice with permission, without having to give explanation, that if they feel that things are overwhelming, and allows them to sort of catch up. That's just one way to give the control. These children also embrace an inclusive environment, and in which taking risks and making mistakes is really okay and expected. They don't like to be in an environment where they feel like they can't make mistakes. Let's remember, they are the ones who had trauma, and they are ones who have higher levels of anxiety and depression. So things that are non-inclusive or don't feel safe does make them feel the trauma response to be higher. These kids also value a coach who guides and supports rather than the ones that tells. So for that, I think the very useful tip is to provide very honest and very constructive and encouraging feedback regularly. So allowing those, not everything has to be positive, but it has to be honest. These kids also, as we all know, they love technology. I mean, there's no going back on that. And I think when it comes to coaching, you can use it cleverly, but I would say it should be sparingly. It shouldn't be the whole thing. They're also the kids who went to Zoom school. So there's a lot of things that they don't like about being online. All right, so let's look at the critical questions when it comes to looking at the pandemic quiz. I think it's really important to look at how did that affect your working environment? And I think it's really important to see that how did it change during COVID? And what changes have remained and what have gone back to normal? And what are the biggest barriers for success within the current working environment? Because I'm sure some of those changes stayed and never went away, and some of those are good ones and some of them are not. And also considering the athletes as well, what the impact COVID-19 has had them. Are there any notable behaviors that are very different than they were pre-pandemic? And are there any notable behaviors from parents of the athletes? Because I'm sure there is, because we all went through the pandemic. So we've all gone through the same experiences in a different way. We've all lived through them. So there's likely that the parents have sort of different behaviors than those that you used to have as the parents of your athletes. And I think the important things is like, how do these behaviors differ from pre-pandemic athletes and parents? That doesn't mean that they're worse than, it just means that they're different. So I think it's important to look at the differences, because once we know what kind of people we're dealing with, we can adapt and sometimes educate so they can adapt to the strategies that we want to use. All right. So since the kids are different, coaching them is also different. And one of the models that I really like to use when it comes to anybody who is trying to motivate athletes to engage in their activities is self-determination theory. And I'm not going into the big parts of it. I'm only going to look at the three main areas that kind of are the precursors or the basic needs that people have. Is when somebody has a sense of autonomy and sense of competence, and they feel like they belong, so sense of relatedness, they're more likely to be motivated to participate. And by definition, motivation is intensity and effort towards a task. So person with autonomy, competence, and relatedness is more likely to put intensity and effort towards a task, which means in our terms, they're going to be better. And once you perform better, it has a cycle that makes you feel more competent, more autonomous, feel like I belong in this environment, which then increase the intensity and effort, which then again results in better outcomes. Looking at the literature, coaches are very important and instrumental in providing all of these types of support, basic need support for their athletes. For the most part, it is the autonomy one that they're the most effective. So I give a couple of examples here. You will see those also in the infographics. But really, the whole point is that if you can facilitate feelings of I choose and give them choice, this is a really important that coaches can do. Competence and relatedness are also important, but for the most part, autonomy support is really something that coaches can help with. So when you look at your role as a coach, I think it's really important to ask yourself, in what ways does my words and my actions convey autonomy support during those swim practices or meets? And the same way, what ways do my words and actions convey competence support? And what ways do my words and my actions convey the relatedness support? So if we can walk away from a practice or a meet that, you know what I just told them and how I interacted and what kind of feedback I gave, that made them feel like, hey, I can do this. So competence support. Or the actions that I asked the group really made them feel like they belong. Or the things that we did, I gave them choice in practices, really boosted their sense of autonomy that I had a choice. Then you've done your job right. Then you've already given them those three basic needs, which will then have an impact on, hey, this was really cool. I feel competent and motivated to put my intensity and effort, and they will walk to next practice with that mindset. The next one is a hard one, and I think it's hard for everybody. But I really love this quote that we have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And big part, as you've seen from all of the slides, is really comes down to communication. And so a part of successful coaching is really having an ability to communicate effectively. And to me, that actually means having a thorough understanding of the basic communication cycle and recognizing that each message that we either send or receive involves a process of encoding and decoding, so constructing and taking apart the message. And each of those processes involves cognitive, affective, and behavior processes. What that really means is that every time we send a message or receive and unpack a message, there is thoughts involved, there is emotions involved, and there are behaviors involved. And because all communication involves emotions, all kinds of emotions, we as humans have a tendency to feel that we need to react immediately. So it's a feeling that I need to respond. It's a feeling that I need to react. So it's not really uncommon for us as coaches and the athletes themselves to react to a certain situation with an emotion. So that could be excitement, that could be panic, that could be anger, that could be all kinds of things. And then we proceed immediately with an emotionally loaded response. And usually that results in a behavior, or sometimes results in a behavior that is not really helpful or beneficial. So what I think it's really important and kind of hidden in the message that we have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Instead of reacting to these messages and allowing those cognitive affective thoughts and emotions kind of take over, and then we do an immediate response, I like us to start thinking about that actually we need to respond to the situation by using those 2 eyes, so taking the observation, using those 2 ears, so using active listening, and then taking a pause before we respond through our action, so the 1 mouth, which then allows us time to process the information, plan the response in a way, and proceed in a way that is actually really beneficial for everybody. This is often a case that not so common necessarily in swimming and regular day-to-day activities, but if you think about something like basketball or volleyball where the coach is heated on the sidelines, more often than not, the first response is always a reaction to the situation. So we feel like we need to have the response. We feel like we're supposed to give the response straight away. But instead, if we say, I heard what you say, can you give me a minute so I can give you a constructive feedback, even if it's on the stroke during practice, it's usually way better constructed and delivered in a way that fosters that person's autonomy, competence, or relatedness. So what I really want us to kind of think about as coaches, we become better if we stop thinking that we have, or feeling that we have to react immediately, and instead we are going to take a pause and respond to those situations. So when it comes to critical questions here, I think it's important that we as coaches reflect on our communication skills. And one of those is really say, how would I describe myself as a communicator? What percentage of my communication is reactive? So really like a response. And what of those are more of the responsive in the way that I'm taking my pauses? Do I use all of my senses when I communicate with my athletes or the parents or other coaches or officials? Am I taking those observations through eyes, and am I listening actively through the ears? And what are the main areas of communication I can improve on? For example, I'm a very much of a, when I communicate, I use hands a lot. You can't see it today purposefully. So my screen is so high up that you can't really see them. But those are the things that I often do. And that can be conveying some kind of messages which may or may not be very useful in certain situations. All right, so my next tip, so 7 tips, is commitment and accountability are skills that require practice. So often coaches and sports psychology people also talk about, well, commitment is important and being accountable for your actions are really important. And I absolutely 100% agree. Research, both in and out of sport, has actually seen both of them, commitment and accountability, as integral for performance success. There's a very big difference, though, what it is. So commitment is a state of being dedicated to a task, action, or behavior. So this really is more of a psychological, I made a commitment. I made a cognitive decision and deliberate decision to dedicate to this task. Accountability then is more of a behavior, so the act of taking responsibility for those actions and behaviors. So I think it's really important to recognize those differences because they are related, but they're not the same. And I really like this quote because I think it really helps. Accountability is the glue that ties commitment to the results. And while commitment is important because it helps focus on direction, and accountability is important because it helps us create a culture of responsibility, helps us resolve conflicts and learn from our mistakes. And collectively, they help building trust and facilitate both personal and collective growth and performance. we can assume that our athletes, particularly post-pandemic, know how to do these skills. Just like any other skills, they require practice. And often, best way to make sure that they learn this practice is we as coaches, we model this behavior, and we make sure that we are consistent in our actions to and facilitate and value commitment and value the accountability. So if let's looking at our critical questions, I think it's important that we kind of take a look and say, what does commitment look like to me? And what does accountability look like to me? So looking at those definitions, I just posted on a previous slide, what does it look like? How do I communicate these commitment, accountability expectations to parents and or athletes in my work setting? Are they very clear? Are they posted on a website? Are they something that everybody signs up for? Are they something that are reinforced when the new group starts at the start of the next season? How do I teach and monitor the commitment and accountability to my athletes? Is it something that every so often I just get mad for them not being there? Or is this something that I have a very visible star chart or something in the pool that shows that? Do I reward somebody who's actually committed and accountable with the athletes? Is it just that they get a reward at the end of the season, or is there any other rewards? Meaning reward doesn't have to be money or bad food, but how do I reward and how do I teach these actionable skills that we want these athletes to have? Equally, in coaching, our own behaviors are a language. We're sending a lot of messages through our language. So it's really important that we ask ourselves that, are my words and behaviors consistent with what I say? When it comes to commitment and accountability, do I practice what I preach? Or am I sort of in between as well? That's not to say that you're doing anything wrong, but it could be that a lot of these are, again, done with the more intuitively rather than with a lot of intentionality. So going back to my first tip. This one is a big one, and I love what Simone Manuel has done to me. She has pretty much written the book in the last couple of months about given all the evidence we need to kind of understand that winning and having fun are not mutually exclusive. Recently, there is a lot of research that's been done about having fun in sport and wanting to be the best and winning are not at opposite end of the spectrum. They can happen at the same time. And if we really look at the science that has come from youth athletes themselves, what makes sport fun for youth athletes, the top 3 reasons why athletes think sport is fun is working hard, having great teammates, and having coaches and parents who will create a positive sport culture. That's what they're looking for. They're not looking for the participation trophies or the swag that they get. It is really about the most important ones. Those are there too, but they're lower on the list. But the most important ones are working hard, having a great teammates, having coaches and parents who create a positive sport culture. And really, when I delve into the data a little bit more, key characteristics of positive coaches who make sport fun, there are 10 of them, and all of those are actionable behaviors. So treating athletes with respect, encouraging the team, being a positive role model, having a very clear and consistent communication, having good sport knowledge, allowing mistakes while staying positive, listening to the athletes or players and taking athletes' opinions into consideration. That doesn't mean that it has to always fly and they get their way, but their views we're taking into consideration. Very positive coaches are easy to talk to. They're nice and friendly, gives compliments when necessary, and they participate with athletes during practice. That doesn't mean that I'm asking coaches to go into the pool, but there are ways in which you can participate with the athletes, and sometimes bringing a little humor and joking around. In fact, one of the things I posted, there's an Ami as the little girl. So my daughter, as you can see, Sherwood Swim Club. One of the things that I have never told her, I've never wished her good luck in a single meet. I've always told her to have fun, which means be the house guy in Finnish. So that's your first word in Finnish, is that because wishing good luck implies that their skills aren't good enough. But if I tell them to have fun, it takes away the pressure and the expectations that I may place on it. And therefore their bodies are more relaxed and they're genuinely swimming better. I think the critical questions for this are, what makes sport fun for me? What makes sport fun for my athletes? I think that's a question you can ask and literally ask them to tell you that. How do I, as a coach, then cultivate my athlete's sense of fun in sport? Remember, it's not just about fun and games. It's not about goofing around. It's about working hard, having great teammates, and having positive experiences for my coaches and the parents around, right? It's not about the goofing around. And equally, another question is, are my behaviors consistent with positive coaching behaviors that have been found to be associated with fun in sport by athletes? So looking at that list, which one of those do you already do? Which ones of those you do intuitively, and which one of those you do with intentionality? And which one's the ones that you could add to your list of things that you do? Top tip number 9, parents are part of the package. Unfortunately, we don't do this without the parents. They are the sole reason why the kids are there. They're the ones who pay for it, and they're the ones who usually provide the transportation. And they're also the ones who bring them all the other things that they need, which is shelter and food and sleep and wash all those 10 minutes of towels and stuff. So they are really part of the triad, the athlete triad, where there are 3 different types of relationships that happen at any given time. And I think we often ignore that they are an equal side of the triangle. And what we really want to do is make sure that the coaches are able to communicate to the parents what do they need from them to be most successful for their kids. This whole series that I've been doing for Wisconsin Swimming started with the parents. And I created this webinar, which is also in all of these infographics. They're all on the Wisconsin Swimming website. And those are sort of philosophies that science has identified as good characteristics and good behaviors for parents to be, so their kids can be successful in their athletic pursuits. I encourage all of your coaches to really read them and maybe listen to the webinar, because they are there for you to use with your parents to educate them so they can better support you in your work. Michigan State University also has a really cool things about 5 key things that you can do with parents to really help them be in your boat and support you. And one of them is to teach them about the sport. Don't assume they already know, or don't rely on that other parents teach them about the sport. Sometimes it's better that it comes from you. It's not a bad idea to develop a code of conduct for parents. You know, you may have some rules. What if we travel? Are the parents allowed to drink alcohol with your club logo on their t-shirts? Things like that. Is you have the right as the club to say, what is the image that we send outside? Create a code of conduct that you want the parents to follow. And obviously kids is the same way. Establish a really effective 2-way communication with parents. That doesn't mean that they can call you at 9 o'clock at night. You can have certain hours of the day that when you accept phone calls. Educate the parents about positive parenting behaviors. And like I said, Wisconsin Swimming now has, well, I would say 10, now 11 bonus tips as well, of what are those positive parenting behaviors that they can follow. Hold a parent meeting at the start of the season, both short course and long course if you feel like it. Get them back on board. Restate that. I know it takes a little time, but it may actually take away a lot of time you spend on the phone with them. And then the last one, ask the Safe Sport Chair. I also think that it would be really useful to encourage parents to complete the Safe Sport Parent Training. Not necessarily because they have to start pointing out sexual abuse and bullying behavior from there, but they get a sense of insight into what the sport is about and what are those things that we want to make sure that we don't happen and does happen when we actually are in the meets and things like that. So for example, if you educate them about the Safe Sport Parent Training and they complete that, the parents will learn that they can take photographs and videos behind the blocks because it may put an athlete in a compromised position. So then you as a coach don't have to interfere with that. So that's another way of also, which is a tip that I added, to really help you educate and teach the parents of what this sport is all about. And then looking at the critical points and questions here, I think the really important is that how much time and effort do I spend weekly interacting with parents? And what percentage of it is positive and what is proactive and what's negative and reactive? I think identifying how do you interact with your parents is a first cue to figure out how do I want to interact with them? And what aspect of this coach-parent communication I do well? And what are the areas that I could improve? And what are the biggest barriers for effective communication with my swim parents? And are there any strategies I could actually implement to overcome these barriers? How could I actually use the Wisconsin Swim and Parent Education material with my swim parents to make it so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, you can use the one that already exists? And we all know that the more parents know in advance, the more they're able to arrange things and make things happen. Last minute requests don't always go that well. So I would highlight here a really important part is to make sure that the communication you have with the parents happens well in advance, is very clear and concise, which will then help get that part of the triangle, athlete triangle on board. Last but not least, I'll still have one more, but this is definitely not the least, is the top tip 10 is put your own mask on before helping others. You as a coach are no good to anybody if you're not well yourself. And I can't highlight that enough. We have a tendency coaches do a job that they're passionate about. They love the sport. They love to put the athletes first at all time. No coach does this job because it's great money or it's the one thing that is gonna secure your $1 million retirement fund in that way. We do this primarily starting from the sheer love of sport. That's where it all starts. So it's really easy to start getting stressed, and it's really easy to put ourselves last on the list of people and things to take care of. While stress is not usually bad, some stress is actually good. Short-term stress is really good. As we already know, it can get us better. Physical stress can really get us better. It's part of our training. It's part of our training cycle. And stress is actually a really natural part of being, and it can have a positive and negative experience. Sometimes under stress, we produce great results. The problem is that if it becomes a long-term or we don't have adequate coping skills, that's when stress can become a problem. And when we're not coping well, it can lead to lack of balance, a lot of impairments in lots of physical health ways, even increased risk of cancer and heart attacks and so forth. It also has an impact on our relationships, and it decreases our mental well-being. So I think it's really important that we recognize all of the different signs and symptoms of prolonged stress, and we also make sure that we put ourselves first. Often it's important to recognize that now I need a break and figure out how can you do that. We will never be positive. We will never be proactive. The communication is not as clear if we're under duress and stress, because then we get snappy, we withdraw from things, we forget things and all those kind of things. So I think it's important that we recognize that we're not superstars in the way that we have to cope with everything. It's really important that we take that break as well. So when it comes to the critical questions on this, I think it's really important for honestly ask, how does stress affect my health, life, and relationships? How do I typically cope with stressful situations? And are my coping strategies healthy, or are they actually harmful? And to what extent do I practice what I preach by taking care of my own health? And what is the one thing I could easily change to improve my own health at this point? All right. So I always put the bonus tip, and with the coaches, I think this is something that takes you thinking in a different way. But what is your coaching and swim philosophy? I just did a talk with athletes about healthy swim philosophy that has the top tips of like the philosophy statements that can create that healthy environment. And I encourage all of the coaches to really look at that. Didn't want to repeat them here, but I wanted to kind of give them to you so you can look at that. But it's a really useful to have the idea that you have a philosophy of how you do this. And most of us do, and most coaches actually have really good philosophies. Whether it's actually intentionally written down and thought through is a different matter. But if you really start thinking about it, you have a set of values and norms and principles that guides the ways in which you coach. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't hurt you to write a philosophy the same way as teachers do, same way as I do as a sports psychology consultant, that what are those guiding values and principles that I go by? What are those strategies that I use? What is the theory that underpin mine? And really, a well-defined coaching philosophy is nothing more than a written around the same principles you convey to your athletes and parents and others. And if we can get this philosophy sort of together, which I guarantee you will evolve and change over years at any given time, it makes those communications so much easier with all of these main stakeholders that I talk about, because we're already very intentional of everything we do. I gave you one example. I'm not sure if it's the greatest one, but it's a start. So you can kind of start thinking about what you want. And in the infographics, there's actually links to like how to get started. So I gave a couple of really direct links of how to get started writing us one if this is something that you're excited about. And I would encourage you to look at both the parent tips and the athlete tips to help you guide the what really goes into your philosophy. All right. So then I only have one more thing, which is the final word of finish, which I promised, and that's the word kiitos, which means thank you. And as you can see in the Wisconsin swimming, we have the programs, and under that, we will have all of these infographics and webinars for everybody to use. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.